So hello everyone and welcome back to our second EcoFest Eco Conversation. And this one is about climate and racism and inclusion. Over the past 6 months, we've had a lot to think about. When lockdown was enforced in its strongest sense in March, the roads fell silent and we began talking about maybe how in the midst of this awful horror of this global pandemic, we could possibly build back in a greener way. And of course, recently Extinction Rebellion has once again reached the headlines through a series of rebellions on the climate crisis. Over the summer, with the terrible news of the killing of George Floyd, there was a movement, another uprising of the Black Lives Matter movement. And this was coupled with the recognition that the COVID pandemic was disproportionately affecting Black and Brown people, who in many cases disproportionately held those low-paid frontline jobs. The issues of climate, justice and equality are interdependent, more interdependent I think than we sometimes realise. Criticism has been raised about the whiteness of climate movements in the West, and people have highlighted how it is those that have the least, predominantly Black and Brown people living in the global South, who are already disproportionately affected by the devastating effects of the climate emergency. Now, we cannot do this topic justice in half an hour, but I'm hoping that we can start a conversation that can be continued by yourselves in other forums. So it's my enormous privilege to be able to introduce two fantastic people who have done much to highlight the issues of climate justice and will bring much wisdom to this conversation. First, we have the Right Reverend Rogers Govender, MBE, Dean of Manchester Cathedral, and a passionate advocate for racial justice and inclusion, as well as a vocal supporter of climate action. And then we have Samantha Lindo. It is Samantha Lindo, not Dylan Jones, as you might see on the camera. She's a singer-songwriter and an activist. She's been featured on BBC Sounds, and she's a member of Christian Climate Action, CCA. And earlier this year, Sam convened an excellent CCA session on climate and colour, which you can find if you go to the CCA website. So hello and welcome to you both.
Hello, Grace, lovely to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, it's great to have you both. I'm going to start by asking you both this starter question, because both of you have been involved with climate action in one form or another. So how did you become involved and what motivated you? Dean Rogers, I'll come to you first.
Hello, everybody. Firstly, I'm not the Right Reverend anything. I'm just the Dean of Manchester. In terms of my involvement with the climate change issues, I originate from South Africa, and I've lived in this country now for the last 20 years. And of course, in the South, the global South, I've seen firsthand the impact of climate change and with the devastating floods and droughts, as well as the extreme, the huge increase in temperatures. It's hotter down in Southern Africa now than when I lived there 20 years ago. So that's one of my first kind of reasons for getting involved. And secondly, being based at Manchester Cathedral, a few years ago, probably 6-7 years ago now, we had to repair the underfloor heating system in the cathedral. And when we considered that piece of work, we had to close. I shut the cathedral down for about 8 months to do the complete repair and replacement of the heating system, because it leaked all over the place and was it was a very cold building. When we replaced it, we had to consider the most eco-friendly system. Long story short, we spent loads of money, couple of million, and we installed what is known as a ground source heat pump system. So basically, I would say about 85 to 90% of our energy stroke heating comes from the River Irwell and underground, 30 meters underground the cathedral. We have sunk huge pipes that basically circulate very warm water from the earth. And that's what powers up our heating system. And I decided to use that project as a way to educate ourselves further and to educate the interfaith community by and large about climate change issues. That's how I got really involved in Manchester.
That's amazing, Dean. Thank you very, very much for telling us that. Sam, maybe you'd like to answer the same question. Well, how have you got involved and what's motivated you?
Well, I suppose it's been a kind of lifelong thing, really, as being aware of these issues as a child, and that kind of innocent childlike love of nature and that kind of intuitive understanding of how we are reliant and connected with creation. So I loved dolphins, basically, when I was a child. But then as I went to university, studying about the politics and the interconnectedness globally and the justice element really led me into activism at university. So I was part of I kind of didn't know what I was going into, but went to a couple of climate camps. And then I became a Christian after that, actually, and I probably compartmentalized my awareness of climate and my faith, both absolutely essential, and God was in both. But I think the church, maybe, I think we'd all agree, sometimes can be about a decade behind culturally as what's going on in the secular world. So I heard people say kind of God will sort out the hole in the ozone layer, whilst kind of talking about us getting our Primark clothes, and I felt a disconnect there. And you know, I campaigned and marched and signed petitions, and I put incredible amounts of energy into reducing my individual carbon footprint. But essentially, a couple of years ago, got married, and my partner and I engaged, and we ended up watching a series of civil rights films. I've also talked about the slave trade. I've been talking about racial justice for a number of years too, and it felt like, where are we in this struggle? Where are we in this struggle? I feel like I am on the side and I need to be in it. And I prayed that dangerous prayer of use me, just use me. And then for our honeymoon, we went on the Camino, and we walked the Camino Santiago. Yeah. And on the way back, it was the April Rebellion 2 years ago, and I just thought, we can't not be there. So we went straight off the Camino and got the train to London, and walked through London and found that iconic pink boat, and we ended up getting in our sleeping bags and just staying overnight. And in the morning, I woke up, and on one side there was all of the people from XR in Bristol, and the other side was Christian Climate Action. So it almost just were completely led to these two tribes of people where, you know, I've then had a space to integrate these two key parts of my life. And actually, I feel like have been released in so many gifts, whether that's, you know, worship, being prophetic, evangelizing in that really sacred space of being actually on the ground, on the front line of this key racial and social justice issue of our time.
Wow, that's amazing. Two amazing and interesting stories that lead us really well into this conversation. Thank you both. Sam, you've talked already very eloquently about your involvement and how you've got involved with activism. In your Climate and Colour session that you did happened earlier this year in the summer, you talked really movingly about your experience in the April Rebellion, and particularly your reflections on being arrested and the challenges that arose from that for you. And I just wondered whether you could share some of that experience with us.
Yeah, I think part of the issues of the words climate change or climate justice is it can seem abstract, and we can be disconnected from the effects of our actions here in the West particularly. So for me, that the jump of making the choice to do that was about a person, was about a relationship, was about really understanding and empathizing with someone's specific situation. And it was a woman who was in London, and she was on the bridge, and she was indigenous to the Amazon, and her stories of her home being destroyed, a home that, you know, they call the Amazon the lungs of the earth, because we are all dependent on that for literally our oxygen. So it's been deforested to an extent where I think it's 25% of it is left, but when it gets to 20, it all disintegrates. So we're at a vital stage. And she spoke of her community resisting that destruction and being faced not by the police but the military, and actually facing death, persecution, murder for the act of not peacefully resisting the destruction of your home. So I just felt like, I've asked to be used, here I am. And I think there were, you know, there was a positive element to that, and then there was a more complicated element to that. So the positive element was that looking around, you know, it made sense. There were so many, particularly women, refusing to move and kind of standing in solidarity with this woman. And it kind of made sense to me historically, because obviously we take advantage of our right to vote, but actually that was won by women stepping outside of the acceptable limits, making themselves vilified, stepping out of the realms of approval, which is something that I struggle hugely with, because I like to be, I'm total teacher's pet, but the desire for justice is bigger than that. So taking that risk out, you know, into potentially being judged, misunderstood, criticized, was out of my comfort zone, but also ultimately liberating. And I spent about 23 hours in a cell, which was really fine at the beginning, but also really horrible, not very nice at all. But I think the thing that is really with me now is that ultimately I was treated well.
Yeah.
I didn't fear for my safety. And I didn't, yes, I feared for my job slightly, but my boss had said, I mean, I was employed as a teacher. My boss had said, I go for it. I agree with you. So I didn't feel scared in that way. But it was a stark contrast to how I'd witnessed young Black men and girls and women being treated even the night before when at a festival site near the protest. And I felt like, although I'm a mixed race person, but because I pass as white, I was treated differently. And this exposing of white privilege and maybe perceived class privilege as well completely exposed my own blindness, even though I've got a real awareness of my Black heritage, to this white privilege, this pervasive privilege which underpins our society. And really it was only, I was aware of it, but this experience of arrest really exposed it and has kind of led me in deconstructing and leading other activists in deconstructing what that privilege means and how we can engage with that.
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you so much, Sam, for sharing that with us. And that brings me on to the next point actually really smoothly. So Dean Rogers, I've been reflecting a lot on how the climate activism movement has taken as its role models some of the great peacemakers of the 20th century, particularly figures such as Martin Luther King and Gandhi, and using their focus on non-violent direct action and resistance, the wave of change. And I do find it really fascinating that one of the foundations of XR's philosophy is this in the movement of the struggle for freedom and equality of Black and brown people. And yet the discourse around arrests and policing has actually meant that Black and brown people, many of whom have articulated this, don't feel comfortable to be part of this movement. Anthony Reddy, in his chapter in the book Time to Act, was very honest about the fact that he would find it really hard to be a member of XR. And so, Dean Rogers, I wondered whether you could maybe talk a little bit about what do you think about this focus on arrest and resistance? Has it helped? Has it been counterproductive? And is there a place for this? And also, are there any other ways? Are there ways in which we can create spaces in climate activism where all feel safe and included?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Grace. Like I said at the beginning, I identified my roots as South African, and we're talking apartheid South Africa. So I'm very used to, I come from a culture of rolling mass action. I myself have been a priest activist and still am, and very, very involved in South Africa. So I've marched endlessly against the beach apartheid and every other form of it. So rolling mass action is nothing new to me whatsoever. And I think it certainly made a difference to us in the political struggle in South Africa. Let me also say that I think, so I don't have a problem with Extinction Rebellion per se. I do think though, even when I lived in South Africa, we have to be selective in the tactics that are used. It can't always just simply be rolling mass action. It has to be combined with other means of getting maximum exposure to the issue. In terms of Black folk and MLK and so on, you're quite right. One of my big sort of bugbears with the climate change movement around the world, and not least in this country, and dare I say in this city, is that it's very much a white kind of movement. Now, you may or may not be aware, I was invited about 2 or 3 years ago to be a member of the Climate Change Board for Manchester City Council. Mm. And I very gladly obviously accepted that invitation. But one of my, you've got to settle in a little bit. One of my critiques of the board was that it was absolutely white, apart from me and one other. And my challenge to the board was, we have something like 15 to 25% of our city population, Black and brown. Where are they around the table? Long story short, we now have a diversity subgroup that has been taking this issue very seriously. And we have now we have now appointed 2 or 3 other BAME folk to the board. Until I challenged them about it, it was a non-issue, because my experience in this country, as well as, dare I say, white South Africa, is that for white folk by and large, and I include the church in this as well, we tend to be rather oblivious of BAME people when it comes to these important issues. So for that reason, BAME folk find it very hard to get terribly involved in Extinction Rebellion or the climate change movement in general. The other thing that I found here in Manchester is that because it's very much a white-led kind of movement, Black and brown communities very rarely feature, excuse me, in the engagement programs. It's like climate change does not involve them, concern them, or they need not be involved in it. Anyhow, through the movement that we set up at the cathedral, our interfaith group called Our Faith, Our Planet, we have been engaging community, the Hindu community, the Muslim community, the Jewish community, and the list goes on and on and on. And in that, and of course, many of these communities are ethnic minority communities, not exclusively, but very much so. And we have now become a very integral component of the climate change concerns in the city at an official level. And doing loads of awareness raising, education, campaigning, and so on and so forth. In that way, we are involving the BAME community, not just at a mass rolling action sort of level, but on the day-to-day stuff, changing hearts and minds, education, engaging young people. Very recently, Extinction Rebellion had a protest meeting. It was last week or the week before in Manchester city centre. Through a friend of mine, in fact, my PA, who's Hindu and Asian, we were able to get her 2 daughters, or young Asian lasses, involved in the public event. They were the only BAME young people involved in the meeting. Otherwise, it was a white sort of, white liberal lefty kind of thing. So the BAME element is often missing. And that's a major critique, and I think the movement needs to do something about it at both a local and a national, and dare I say an international level, because at the end of the day, it's the poor folk of our city and our country and the world, in the global south and elsewhere, who are suffering the effects of climate change, which we wealthy middle class people in the West, in Western industrialized countries, are causing in terms of our carbon emissions. So they're all very, very linked, and we need to work with both together, because you can't tackle the one without tackling racism, as well as all the other issues regarding exclusion in our society.
I think these are really, really, really good points. And you've both raised about these issues, the fact that climate justice, racism, poverty, they're all interlinked with the climate emergency. They're all issues that come together. And I was wondering, how do you think we as individuals, you've talked a little bit about this already, but as individuals and with our gifts, but also within our churches as people of faith, how do we raise these issues? How do we become, I think you used the term, Samantha, talking about the prophetic voice. What can we be doing more to raise that voice and raise these issues into our consciousness? Sam, would you like to go first?
Yeah, following, I think changing our imagery and our language and where we put our energy is really key. So it is a social, racial justice issue as well. When we're stuck with polar bears and a kind of, yes, nature is deeply important, but we need to be specific about the justice issues and make sure that messaging is key. And also we need to empower. I mean, in Bristol, for example, our air pollution is still at illegal levels. it's worse in the most deprived areas, and the most deprived areas are the areas with the greatest minority ethnic communities. So that justice issue is true on a micro scale and on a macro scale. So we need to be specific about that. I think we need to, in our conversations in church, we need to join up the dots. We need to join up the dots. Firstly, just having conversations stops the denial, because the silence is complicit with the denial. And it's very human. It's a very human thing to be in denial, because we don't want this to exist. And so we find it hard to talk about it. But there's an overlap between denial and white privilege. And we need to be very, very aware of that, because it's not affecting middle classes in the West right now, but it is affecting everybody else. So our silence is complicity. We need to break that. We need to, we need to be really careful in the church about joining the dots and being in solidarity, not charity. So first of all, naming the thing that can't be named. Like in your question, in your write-up, Grace, I noticed that you talked about capitalism. And when we, that is a scary word, because there's a quote, I think it was Helder Kamara said, "When I give food to the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why they are poor, they call me a communist." So we don't like to be political, we don't like to use those words, but unless we find some language to talk about the institutional violence, and look at institutional sin and our relationship with it, we're going to be focusing on our small little sins and completely, and of course they're important, but completely ignoring this idea, almost like this power and principalities, this sin that is institutional and that we have a relationship with. So we need to be looking at that, speaking about that. I won't go on too much longer, but we need to not just be fishing bodies out of the water. We need to be going upstream and looking at what is actually causing that to happen. So as well as our mission work and our aid work, we need to be categorically taking responsibility for our input into that. And I think, just tangibly, I think finding out about CCA, researching that, doing a talk in your church, starting a CCA group, finding a local issue like air pollution or something very tangible, and getting behind the initiatives that are happening and adding our Christian voice to that. And very lastly and tangibly, signing the CCEE bill, which is a bill that's just been proposed to Parliament. 50 MPs are behind it, and it means the government will be legally obliged to take action and to fulfil the Paris Agreement, which it already agreed to and is completely broken. So we need to be together in holding the government to account for that.
Thank you so much, Sam. Thank you for the many ways in which you articulated that so well. It's brilliant. Dean Rogers, have you got anything you want to add to that about how we as churches and as faith communities can speak into these issues?
I think a lot of this work, is ongoing education work, and it needs resourcing. The question we could ask ourselves here in Manchester, for our Church of England, for instance, to which you and I belong, is why do we not have a full-time climate change officer? Why is it just a half-time job? We know that there's no half-time vicars, and there are no half-time jobs. They all you end up doing more than half-time. But if we feel so strongly about it, why are we not putting our money where our mouth is? We ought to have done by now an audit of all of our churches and our church buildings, vicarages, church halls, church buildings. That audit should have taken place so we can measure our carbon footprint and do something about it. General Synod passed a motion calling on parishes and dioceses to reduce our carbon footprint by I think it was 2030. That's 10 years. Has that filtered down to parishes? No, we haven't heard about it locally yet. so a fair amount of talk as religious people tend to be involved in, not much action as usual. The other thing is I like what Sam said about joining the dots. We need to remember that climate change and the carbon footprint kind of matters are not Christian issues. They affect all faiths, they affect all people. And we've got to be in working with, collaborating with people of other faiths or no faith, with city councils, central government, local government, whoever, wherever, because it's an emergency that impacts all of humanity, all of creation. So let's not get sectarian about it. Let's connect with others so we can tackle it together.
Fantastic, thank you. Absolutely brilliant. Now we have gone a little bit over, but we're going to ask this last question because this is an important topic, and so I don't want to just rush it too much. I just wanted to finish though by asking you both. I was at a climate conference recently with young people, and a lot were talking about the grief of the climate emergency and how we can feel quite overwhelmed by it at times. And so I just wanted to ask you very briefly, how do you both care for yourselves within this space, and where do you find hope? So Sam, if I come to you first.
I think telling myself, feeling the feelings, giving myself permission to feel the feelings and know that it is an appropriate response to this situation. So I think one thing are the feelings, but then feeling shame or I shouldn't feel like this or come on, get a grip is almost as damaging. So being honest about what I'm feeling, maybe telling someone, my partner, and then from that place, making your plans, making the commitments, say what you're going to do. And then from action, I find hope. And I think the last thing I'll say is, it's hard when you're feeling grief, which I have been, especially this week. The hard thing is to then you have a conversation and someone says, how are you? And you're meant to say, I'm fine. Actually, don't. No. Just say, actually, I'm feeling an incredible amount of grief this week, and giving myself the permission to stop pretending and using energy to make other people feel comfortable, because actually when we are honest about our emotions to other people, that's how they start engaging with it, and that's how they start taking action. So let's not be suppressed and British about it. Let's actually be honest and allow those emotions to flow and to use them.
Amazing. So it's about naming it, isn't it, and being honest in that. Yeah, absolutely. Dean Rogers, have you got anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I would say yes, there is a fair amount of grief, but there's a lot of hope. And again, I think it's recognizing that climate change and the issues of carbon emissions and so on are not standalone issues. They're connected with fair trade, for instance. So we find hope in when we see farmers in third world countries, getting paid properly for their produce, and when we see trade justice going on around the world, they're all connected. And when we see somebody having a small micro loan, being able to set up a little garden and then being able to produce their own food in South Africa or somewhere in Africa or Asia or Latin America, that's incredible, hopeful stuff. And we need to take heart from that. And also just little things like, do not litter. We see so much of littering still in our city. It's quite incredible. It's just doing little things like that. You can't change the world, but you can change some little thing in the world by your own behavior and your own actions in your own church building, in your own home. It's small little acts that add up and become big acts. And don't focus on the major issues and the major campaigns. Focus on the little bits, and that's what makes all the difference.
Well, thank you both so much for this really interesting conversation. I think we could talk all day about this issue, and I hope that for those watching at home, that this has helped you to start thinking about the conversations you might want to have, or where you might want to take this. So Dean Rogers and Samantha Lindo, thank you so much for coming and speaking to me today and taking that time out.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
Take care.
I'll post the link to the CEE bill so you can share it with everybody.
That would be amazing. Thank you so much, Sam.
Take care, Grace. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.